Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host with another marvelous video. In all of the stories, be it from the comics, films or shows, Professor X has evolved from a wise and powerful mentor to a vulnerable and conflicted man. He often struggles with the dynamics of mutant and human relationships and tries to protect and guide his X-Men. Having said that, Xavier has always been the guiding force, the mentor with a plan. Whether in a leadership role or as a father figure, he's been the backbone of the X-Men's animated adventures. In this video, we'll explore Professor X's entire life story as depicted in the scores and scores of comics, movies, as well as the animated shows. So, without further ado, let's begin. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Murder in the Womb. Charles Francis Xavier's story kicks off in a pretty wild way. His dad, Dr. Brian Xavier, was a big-shot geneticist working at this hush-hush facility in Alamogordo, New Mexico. There, Brian teamed up with the brains of the business, like Irene Adler, Alexander Reiking, Kurt Marco, and Nathan Milbury. People whispered all sorts of stuff about Brian's work, from nuclear research to top-secret mutant studies, but that was just a facade for the public. In reality, he was part of this covert operation called Black Womb, headed by Milbury. But Milbury wasn't really Milbury. He was, in fact, Nathaniel Essex, a nearly immortal geneticist. You'd better know Essex as Mr. Sinister. So anyway, Essex was knee-deep into experimenting with human mutation in an attempt to jumpstart the era of mutants. Homo sapiens superior, or simply the Homo superior. Now, while Brian and his wife Sharon were expecting Charles, their embryo did a split during mitosis, which resulted in twins, Charles and his sister. But get this, Charles's twin sister gained awareness in the womb itself and tried to kill him. That sounds like the worst ever case of sibling rivalry. But Charles, with his early blooming mental powers, fought back, apparently killing her. So yeah, you could say that the good old Professor X killed his twin, being used as a child test subject. Clearly, Charles Xavier's childhood was no walk in the park, and this murder in the womb set the tone for what was to come for Charles in his childhood as well as adulthood. He and some other kids like Carter Reiking, Kane Marco, and Mortimer Toynbee were part of Dr. Milbury's experiments. Speaking of Kane, he became one of the most ruthless and powerful villains in Marvel's history, but we'll come to that in just a bit. Anyway, Milbury was using them for his own shady plans. Meanwhile, Charles and Carter, they headed off, and the two would spend a lot of time playing around the Alamogordo facility where their dads worked. Meanwhile, Sinister had this grand scheme to create bodies he could hop into if he ever needed a new one. He was secretly experimenting on Charles, messing with his memories to keep it under wraps. Charles wouldn't find out about this until way later. At home, Charles was getting super close to his mum, thanks to his emerging telepathic powers. He didn't realize it, but he was reading her mind, which made their bond really strong. Losing both parents. When Charles was just 9, tragedy struck Charles's life. His dad, Brian Xavier, died in an explosion. In fact, Kurt Marco, Brian's colleague and a bit of a green-eyed monster about Brian's wealth, could have saved him but didn't. Quite unexpectedly, Kurt swooped in and played the comforting shoulder for Charles's mum, and the next thing you know, they were married. Kurt was after the Xavier fortune. Charles, with his telepathy kicking in, started piecing together that Kurt might have had a hand in his dad's death. Then, Kane Marco, Kurt's son from another marriage, moved in. Kane was the definition of a bully, constantly tormenting Charles. Life at home was rough. Kurt was abusive toward Sharon, and Charles felt all of it because of their mental connection. Sharon stayed with Kurt because she thought it was best to raise Charles, and the poor woman continued to endure the abuse. Interestingly, Kurt actually showed some care for Charles, probably because of his smarts, which only made Kane more bitter. Eventually, Sharon passed away, leaving Charles in Kurt's care. One night, Kane and Kurt got into a heated argument about money, and Kane accused Kurt of killing Brian. Charles, overhearing this, confronted them about the truth. The confrontation turned ugly, and Kane tossed a vial of chemicals, which caused an explosion. Kurt tried to save Charles from the fire, which earned him even more hate from Kane. While saving Charles and Kane, Kurt got fatally injured. In his last moments, Kurt confessed to Charles that he didn't save Brian, and warned Charles about Kane, especially if Kane ever found out about Charles's telepathic powers. Academic life. Charles Xavier's mutant powers came with a side effect. Well, he started losing his hair early and was totally bald as a teen. But hey, no hair, no problem, because his powers made him a whiz kid in school. Charles nailed it, thanks to his mind-reading mojo. As Charles racked up his grades and trophies, his stepbrother got more and more green with envy. The two butted heads quite a bit. However, Charles breezed through high school and was soon ready for college way early. By 16, Charles was already out of Harvard with honors. But why stop there? He headed to Columbia, then hopped across the pond to Oxford. The guy ended up with a string of PhDs in psychology, genetics, biophysics, anthropology, and psychiatry. At Oxford, Charles Xavier hit it off with Moira Kinross. They both were into genetic mutation, but Charles kept his mutant powers a secret from Moira. Little did he know, one of his professors was actually Mr. Sinister in disguise. Things got a bit complicated when Charles started falling for Moira, but she was already seeing this soldier guy, Joe McTaggart. Moira, Charles, and Joe went on this grand tour around the UK. It seemed like Joe was winning Moira over until they had this accident after leaving a pub. Charles tuned in with his mental powers and swooped in to save Moira from a wild river. That heroic act made Moira fall for Charles, and she ditched Joe. Eventually, Charles opened up to Moira about his mutant identity, and they even got engaged. While vacationing in the French Riviera, Charles shared his vision of a world where humans and mutants would live together in peace. But back then, he was more into giving lectures and dreaming of a family life than anything else. Then, these two mutants, Logan and Victor Creed, showed up on campus. They were rallying mutants against the US government's anti-mutant actions. Charles, however, wasn't into it and turned them down, a decision he'd regret later. After wrapping up his studies, Charles wanted to prove his worth to Moira and joined the military. Military life. Charles Xavier's time in the military, especially during a conflict in Southeast Asia, was full of hurdles, both personal and professional. He was bombarded by the thoughts of the wounded and dying. With some serious mental gymnastics, he built mental barriers to keep his sanity and block out the noise. Things got even more complicated when he bumped into his stepbrother Kane in the same unit. During a mission, Kane tried to ditch his post and Charles, trying to save him from a court-martial, followed him. They ended up in the Temple of Cyttorak, where Kane found this crimson gem and turned into the Juggernaut. The place caved in, and while Charles got out, Kane got buried and was stuck there for ages. Meanwhile, Charles then received this letter from Moira calling off their engagement and telling him not to look for her. Heartbroken, Charles torched the letter and dove deeper into his military life. He became known as the Good Shepherd in the military search and rescue because he extensively used his telepathy to help others. But he started taking too many risks, almost like he didn't care for his own life. Charles served alongside Carmen Pride and, apparently, Logan. He wasn't exactly best buds with Logan, but he and Pride shared a rather personal bond. Pride even wanted Charles as his best man, but was bummed when Charles signed up for another tour after Moira's breakup. In a later mission, Charles lost his team and got injured, which ended his combat days. Finding his purpose. Back in the States, Charles Xavier stumbled upon a growing anti-mutant hysteria, with the government brushing off mutant incidents as fake news. His high IQ had caught the military's attention, so Charles used his mental mojo to sneak into the Pentagon. There, he discovered the military's partnership with inventor Bolivar Trask to tackle the so-called mutant menace. Smooth talking with his powers, he got himself an honorable discharge and snooped around to learn about the FBI's mutant project. Right as he was leaving, the military, aided by a mutant named Virus, launched a sentinel attack on Logan's mutant gang. Charles, hitching a ride with FBI agent Fred Duncan, saw the chaos unfold. Using his powers, he helped many mutants escape. His interference led the government to deem the Sentinel project too expensive and ditched it, which left only Agent Duncan on the mutant case. After his military stint, his heart still aching from the Moira breakup, Charles started globetrotting. He went to the peaceful Isle of Kyrinos in Greece, then Cairo, Egypt, about 20 years before the modern age kicked in. There, he stopped a young pickpocket and got into a telepathic battle with her boss, Amal Farouk, in the astral plane. Charles won, but Farouk seemingly died. This fight was a wake-up call for Charles. He realized his mission was to stop evil mutants wherever they popped up. Meeting Magneto and his future son. In Israel, Charles Xavier started using his telepathic powers to help folks dealing with mental trauma. There, he teamed up with a Holocaust survivor known as Magnus, who was actually our favorite master of magnetism. They bonded over their interest in genetic mutations, but Charles kept his own mutant status a secret, not realizing Magnus was a mutant too. Charles also started treating Gabrielle Haller, a woman who had gone catatonic from her horrific experience in a concentration camp. Using his telepathic abilities, he helped Gabrielle come out of her catatonic state. The two developed a close relationship, with Charles secretly nudging things along with his powers. The medical facility they were at had this amnesiac patient, John Doe, who was actually David Haller, Xavier and Gabrielle's future son. Neither knew it at the time, but this John Doe had his own mutant powers, like mind probing and creating psychic images. He even showed some pyrokinetic skills. Xavier and Magnus were chilling in a bar when they got into a scrap with some locals messing with a homeless amputee. After the brawl, Charles got a frantic call from Gabrielle. They rushed over to find that John Doe had regained his memories and was planning to kill Magnus. David found himself in a fight with the X-Men, which he knew was a team of mutants that Xavier himself would later help form. Despite their efforts, David almost finished off Magnus. Just as he was about to strike with a sign knife, a time traveler named Bishop stepped in. Bishop's future was a bleak one, where David accidentally killed Xavier, leading to Apocalypse taking over the Earth. By stabbing him with the Psi Blade, Bishop revealed the truth to David, causing both him and Bishop to vanish. This whole episode got erased from everyone's memories, including Magnus, Xavier, and Gabrielle. Next up, Gabrielle became a target for Hydra, the notorious terrorist group. They took her, hunting for some lost Nazi gold. Xavier and Magnus teamed up, took down Hydra's leader Baron Strucker and his goons in Kenya, and discovered their mutual mutant powers. But the fallout was grim. Magnus, disillusioned about peace between humans and mutants, took off with the Nazi gold to fund his anti-human campaign. As life went on, Charles and Gabrielle's paths diverged. Charles had a wandering heart and wanted to travel more. They split, not knowing Gabrielle was pregnant with Xavier's son. She kept it quiet and raised the kid with Daniel Shomran, Xavier's old colleague, whom she married. Getting crippled. After meeting several mutants, Charles Xavier started thinking big. He wanted to gather mutants and train them for the greater good. He contacted Moira McTaggart in the hope to dig into her mutant research, but she wasn't too keen on sharing. Charles kept on globetrotting and his telepathy led him to an ancient temple. There, he teamed up with Gracie Gamble and Cuckoo of the Destine clan. They were busy stopping this otherworldly creature, the Sin Wraith, from crashing into our dimension. They managed to push it back, but Gracie wiped Charles's memory of the whole event to protect him. During his travels, Charles heard about another telepath, Tobias Messenger, who was rallying mutants. But before Charles could meet him, Messenger vanished. Later, Charles found himself in Tibet, stumbling upon a city under the control of an alien baddie named Lucifer. Charles led a rebellion against Lucifer but got seriously injured when a block fell on him, leaving him crippled from the waist down. Mentally calling for help, he was rescued by a mutant who'd later be known as Sage. After his injury, Charles Xavier ended up in a hospital in India, where doctors revealed that he wouldn't walk again. During his recovery, he met a young American nurse, Amelia Voigt. Amelia was no nonsense and pushed Charles hard in his rehab, helping him find a new zest for life. 3 months down the line, Charles and Amelia shacked up in an apartment in Bombay, now Mumbai. That's where Charles started designing Cerebro, a mutant-detecting supercomputer. Amelia, who was a mutant herself, got a bit rattled when she found out about Cerebro, but she chilled when Charles let on that he was a mutant too. Even though Amelia stuck with Charles, she wasn't thrilled about the idea of gathering and training mutants for the whole peaceful coexistence mission. She was more into living a low-key mutant life. Still, Amelia tagged along with Charles back to the US to kickstart his school for gifted youngsters. During this time, Charles also worked with Dr. Carl Lykos and Moira McTaggart on Project Mutant. Eventually, they all went their separate ways, with Moira keeping the project facility running for years. Meeting Jean. Back in the US, Charles Xavier was approached by John and Elaine Gray about their daughter, Jean, who developed telepathic and telekinetic powers. Jean was shaken up after experiencing her friend's death through telepathy. Xavier managed to coax Jean out of her trauma and started helping her control her powers. Meanwhile, Xavier was becoming a big deal in the lecture circuit and gained a name for himself in the study of mutations. He was working with Moira McTaggart to tutor Jean Grey and tinkering with his early Cerebro prototypes. During these tests, Charles and Jean tapped into the mind of another young mutant, Scott Summers. Jean and Scott clicked, but Xavier kept it hush, making Scott think it was just a dream. As Jean's telekinesis got better, Xavier kept a lookout for other mutants. He found Pietro and Wanda Maximoff, but Pietro nixed the idea of going to America with Xavier. Instead, they later joined Magneto, who by now was rallying mutants for his own agenda. Xavier, accompanied by Amelia, confronted Magneto at the Auschwitz concentration camp on the anniversary of his imprisonment there. Xavier tried to persuade Magneto to join him in striving for peace between humans and mutants. But Magneto, deep in his hatred for humanity, wasn't having it. He warned Xavier that they'd be enemies the next time they met. Xavier continued to help Jean control her powers, making solid progress. However, a setback at a mall with her telepathy made Xavier decide to focus solely on her telekinesis for the time being, putting her telepathy on hold. Another lost love. Xavier decided it was time to step up his game in recruiting mutants. He got back in touch with Fred Duncan at the FBI, who was dealing with a spike in anti-mutant hysteria. When Xavier heard about Scott Summers' powers going haywire, he convinced Duncan to let him track down and train Scott for his cause. But Xavier was a bit late to the party. By the time he found Scott, a mutant crook named Jack Winters had already scooped him up. Winters wanted to use Scott to access a cyclotron, aiming to turn himself into a living diamond. Xavier followed them and ended up in a mind battle with Winters. The first round didn't go well for Xavier, who got buried alive while Winters transformed into the living diamond. Xavier saved Scott from some security guards and roped him into stopping Winters. They overloaded Winters with the cyclotron's energy, causing him to implode. Back at his school, Xavier welcomed Scott as the first member of his new team, the X-Men and called him Cyclops. Meanwhile, Amelia Voigt was getting fed up with his mutant recruiting mission. She wanted him to drop it all and be with her. When Xavier couldn't decide, Amelia tried to leave. In a moment of panic, Xavier used his powers to stop her, but immediately regretted it. Realizing what he'd done, he let her go, but the damage was done. Amelia walked out of his life for good. Meeting Beast. Xavier's next recruit was Warren Worthington III, a rich kid with wings that let him fly. Xavier couldn't reach him right away, so he used telepathy to help Warren when a fanatic attacked him, thinking his wings were an insult to God. Then came Robert Drake, aka Bobby, who had the literally cool ability to control ice. After Bobby froze a bully solid, he landed in jail, and a lynch mob was out for blood. Xavier sent Cyclops to Fort Worthington to bust him out. Bobby was stubborn though, and fought Cyclops until the mob caught up. That's when Xavier stepped in, wiped everyone's memory of Bobby's powers, and invited him to join his school. Bobby said yes and became Iceman, the second X-Man. Meanwhile, Xavier was busy convincing the Greys to let their daughter Jean join his school. He was building up his team, one mutant at a time. Xavier shifted his focus back to Warren Worthington, who'd started his own superhero gig as the Avenging Angel. Xavier tracked him down and sent Cyclops and Iceman to recruit him right after Angel got his hands on a stolen radioactive isotope. The isotope messed with Angel's head, leading to a scrap with the X-Men. Xavier, using his telepathy, talked Warren into chucking the isotope sky high where it blew up without hurting anyone. Sanity back, Warren joined the X-Men, rebranding himself as simply Angel. Next up, Charles spotted a new story about Henry McCoy, a high school football star in Duffy, Illinois. Henry's extraordinary agility and oversized hands and feet were a dead giveaway of his mutant nature. But he wasn't just on Xavier's radar. A villain called the Conquistador also wanted to use Henry's abilities for his world domination plans. Before Xavier and his crew could make a move, the Conquistador kidnapped Henry and his folks. Xavier tracked them down to a nuclear research facility where Henry was being forced to steal a solar power device. He sent his X-Men to bust Henry and his family out of the Conquistador's hideout. Interestingly, there's a couple of versions of how it went down. One where the Conquistador got taken out in a blast from the overloaded device, and another where he survived without any explosion. Either way, Henry was free and decided to join Xavier's school and adopted the name Beast. Just like with Iceman, Xavier used his powers to erase the town's memory of Henry's mutant antics. The X-Men team was shaping up, with each new member bringing something unique to the table. The X-Men. With Jean Grey on board, Xavier's X-Men team was all set. He started training them in the Danger Room, a special setup he created. This didn't sit well with Moira McTaggart, who was a bit skeptical about Xavier's methods. Xavier, meanwhile, was curious about Scott Summers' past and suspected he'd met other mutants before joining the X-Men. But not everything was smooth sailing. Hank McCoy, aka Beast, was pretty upset that Xavier had wiped his existence from his hometown's memory. Xavier eventually got Hank to see that it was for the best, both for the people he knew and for his own safety. In training, Xavier always reminded Beast not to underestimate his enemies. Xavier and Moira tried to recruit Emma Frost next, the daughter of wealthy Winston Frost. When Winston wouldn't bite, Xavier reached out to Emma telepathically. However, she turned him down, especially after Charles suggested altering her dad's mind. They left without her. Xavier and Moira then started diving into files on international mutants like Peter Rasputin, Aurora Monroe, and Kurt Wagner, planning to expand the X-Men globally. But that had to wait, as Xavier shifted his focus to the growing threat posed by Magneto. Xavier also tried to connect with a mutant named Sandu during a rampage, but couldn't get through to him. Sandu was eventually taken down by Thor, the Asgardian Thunder God. Throughout all this, Xavier was juggling his role as a mentor to the X-Men, exploring new mutant prospects, and dealing with the looming threat of Magneto. It was a balancing act between nurturing his team and addressing the larger mutant concerns in the world. The first X-Men mission. Now known as Professor X, Xavier was ready to send out the X-Men into the real world. Their first big challenge was stopping Magneto, Xavier's old buddy turned adversary, from hijacking the Cape Citadel missile base. Under Xavier's lead, the X-Men thwarted Magneto's plans. Recognizing his skills and potential, Xavier appointed Cyclops as the field leader of the team. Scott was hesitant as he felt unworthy due to his unstable powers, but Xavier saw his true capabilities. When the Vanisher, a mutant teleporter, started swiping government secrets, Professor X stepped in. He offered the X-Men's help to the government and personally took down the Vanisher by cutting off his teleportation abilities, making it a breeze for the X-Men to capture him and his crew. When Angel got exposed with radiation from a Stark Industries test, it totally changed his personality. Xavier let Iron Man handle that mess until Angel got back to normal. In return, when Iron Man needed help finding his runaway Avengers teammate, the Hulk, Xavier agreed to send the X-Men. But the Hulk slipped away before they could do anything about it. The X-Men also teamed up with the Sentry, a super powerful hero, to take down his enemy named the General. Now, this guy was plotting to nuke France. With the X-Men's help, the General's plan was foiled. Under his guidance, the X-Men were becoming crucial players in larger battles, whether it was against mutants like the Vanisher, handling tricky situations like Angel's radiation exposure, or teaming up with other heroes in the fight for justice. Xavier stumbled upon the Blob, who was part of a carnival. Initially keen to bring him into the X-Men, Xavier soon realized his mistake when the Blob turned hostile and attacked their base. With the X-Men fending off the Blob and his carnival crew, Xavier built up a gadget to erase their memories of the X-Men's HQ and secret identities. During a routine training session, the X-Men got a surprise visit from a medieval knight, who vanished as quickly as he appeared. After some more training, Xavier took on Magneto again, this time in a mental duel on the astral plane. Meanwhile, Magneto and his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, which now included reluctant members Pietro and Wanda Maximoff, or Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, took over Santo Marco in South America. Xavier sent the X-Men to deal with them, and after a heated battle, the Brotherhood had to bail. In the chaos, Xavier heroically threw himself at a rigged door to save his team from an explosion. He then led the X-Men to believe he'd lost his mental powers, which was actually a ruse. Later, when the X-Men got trapped in Magneto's asteroid M, they managed to escape on their own. Xavier revealed his deception about losing his powers, explaining it was a test to see if they could handle situations without him. However, the puppet master and the Mad Thinker brainwashed Xavier and used him to order the X-Men to attack the Fantastic Four. The two teams clashed, but eventually, Xavier broke free from the puppet master's control. He exposed the whole setup, and the puppet master and the Thinker skedaddled before the Fantastic Four and X-Men could take them. Xavier's journey as Professor X was full of twists and turns, from dealing with unpredictable mutants like the Blob to outsmarting villains like Magneto. Facing Darkseid, Xavier and the X-Men were yanked forward in time by a hero named Access. They found themselves up against the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, who had joined forces with Darkseid and his Apocalyptians in a bid to dominate both universes. The X-Men teamed up with the Avengers, Justice League of America, and the Teen Titans from Darkseid's dimension to tackle this mega threat. While Access, with an army of combined heroes, took the fight to Magneto and Darkseid on Asteroid M, Beast, Xavier, and Cyclops stayed on Earth to handle the fallout there. After Access and his crew put Darkseid and Magneto in their place, everyone was sent back to their original times and dimensions. Back home, the memories of these wild events started to fade from the X-Men's minds. Next up, Xavier learned that the Submariner Namor was a mutant. Both Xavier and Magneto tried to recruit him, but Magneto got to him first. This led to yet another clash between the X-Men and the Brotherhood. Namor, realizing Magneto wanted to boss him around, decided not to join either side. The X-Men managed to send Magneto and his crew, but Namor wasn't interested in teaming up with the X-Men either. Later, when the Human Torch sent a call out to Spider-Man, Xavier told the X-Men to stay out of it, deeming it unrelated to their mission. Throughout these adventures, Xavier's leadership and strategic thinking were key. The next mission for Xavier's X-Men was to stop the Brotherhood from trying to rope Thor, the Thunder God, into their ranks, wrongly thinking he was a mutant. But when the X-Men showed up, Magneto and his crew decided to bail. Then things got time-trippy again for Professor X and the X-Men. This time, they were pulled forward by Sidestep, a hitman looking to take out the British superhero team Excalibur, a future version of the X-Men, on behalf of Dr. Doom. Each X-Man had their memories tweaked to fit into different eras and were pitted against Excalibur members. Xavier found himself in a bleak future, Earth 811, where Sentinel robots ruled. There, he got fused to a Sentinel and had to fight Cerise, a Shi'ar warrior. Outmatched, Xavier was soon back in the present. The X-Men and Excalibur clashed until Xavier read the mind of Excalibur's leader, Nightcrawler, and figured out the whole setup. After Nightcrawler wrecked Sidestep's time travel gear, everyone returned to their correct times and places, with the X-Men's memories of the whole episode getting wiped. Graduation of His XMen. Once the X-Men wrapped up their training and classes, Professor X threw them a low-key graduation bash. It was just the team celebrating their achievements. After the party, Xavier showed Cyclops the spot where he built the first Cerebro and dropped a bombshell. He was heading out on a secret mission and wanted Cyclops to take the reins at the school. Scott was hesitant, but he stepped up to the plate. Xavier's mission was to track down his old enemy, Lucifer, who was stirring up trouble in Europe. While on the hunt, he got a call from Scott, letting him know Beast was thinking of leaving the team. Xavier told Scott he did his best, but luckily, Beast decided to come back on his own. When Xavier finally found Lucifer, things escalated quickly. He learned Lucifer had a bomb set to level Europe, rigged to go off if his heart stopped. Then the Avengers showed up, curious about the commotion. Xavier had the X-Men keep them back while he used a mental bolt to knock out Lucifer. After clearing the air with the Avengers, they left the X-Men to handle things. With his students' help, Xavier defused the bomb. When Lucifer came back, Xavier let him walk away, knowing he was beaten fair and square. As the X-Men moved on to the next level of their superhero gig, Professor X hooked them up with some fresh alternate costumes for field ops. He also upgraded Cerebro with an AI teacher to keep the team sharp when he was either out or swamped. Xavier caught wind of something weird going on with plants and animals near the mansion. The X-Men traced it all the way to Greenland, where they stopped some scientists from drilling into a spot that would have disturbed some ancient Earth-dominating creatures in the last leg of their life cycle. The scientists got the message and picked a new spot for their global warming research. Back at the mansion, Jean tried to spice up a training session by offering a date as a prize in a race to the danger room. Professor X and Cyclops, though, weren't having it and shut that down quick. Xavier and Cyclops later arrived at State University to scout for potential mutants, but it was a bust. They did, however, bump into the Fantastic Four. The X-Men got an invite to the engagement party of Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Girl from the Fantastic Four. Xavier, still keeping his X-Men connection under wraps, had to play it cool, acting like they were all strangers. During a quieter period, the X-Men went to check out reports of a wild man in Antarctica. This adventure led them to discover the Savage Land and make a pal in Kazar, the ruler there. Needing a break, Xavier took the team to the Florida Everglades to visit his old buddy Kurt Connors. But surprise, Connors had turned into the Lizard again. Beast, Angel, and Iceman helped capture the Lizard and turn him back to human. Xavier used this trip to give Scott and Jean some quality time together, nurturing their budding romance. When the rest of the team caught the flu, Xavier sent Cyclops solo to the Blue Ridge Mountains in West Virginia. There, Cyclops, with Xavier's guidance, had to deal with a mutant named Frederick who was causing disappearances. Frederick was unstable, and Cyclops had to make the tough call to stop him, seemingly for good, to save the people he'd taken. No more brotherhood, for now. When Charles got wind of a possible new mutant, he sent the X-Men to check it out. Turned out, it was another tangle with the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. This new mutant was actually a space dude named the Stranger, who was on Earth to study mutants. In the chaos, the Stranger turned Mastermind into a statue and took Magneto and Toad for his own spacey research. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver decided they were done with Magneto's drama and split. Back at the mansion, Xavier had to figure out what to do with Mastermind's frozen form. But before they could catch a break, Xavier's stepbrother Kane, now the Juggernaut, busted out of his longtime prison and headed straight for them. Xavier got the X-Men ready and revealed his connection to Juggernaut. Despite their efforts, Juggernaut plowed through their defenses. With Juggernaut's mind shielded by a psi-proof helmet, Xavier sought the Human Torch for some help. The X-Men held Juggernaut off while the Torch torched his helmet, leaving him open to a mental smackdown from Xavier. After the dust settled, Xavier wiped the Torch's memory of the whole shebang and their HQ's location. Xavier kept Juggernaut in a coma on the mansion grounds, but the team was pretty beat up. He decided they all needed a break from the hero life. During this downtime, Xavier went hunting for a mutant in Africa, but got trapped in an ancient cavern that drained his willpower. He reached out to the X-Men for help, and they came through, teaming up with an old-time adventurer, Gorilla Man, to pull Xavier out of that jam. Marvel Girl, aka Jean Grey, hit it off with the Scarlet Witch, who was trying to turn over a new leaf after ditching the Brotherhood. Things got intense when the witch got roped into a S.H.I.E.L.D. mission. Xavier, ever the tracker, pinpointed her location and sent the X-Men to lend a hand. They ended up helping the Witch and the Black Widow foil a Hydra scheme to swipe an experimental sub. Xavier played his part by using his mental powers to block Hydra's brainwashing attempts, leading to their defeat. Later, Xavier teamed up with his students and Thor to handle a pretty wild situation. Some members of the Midgard Veneer had taken Iceman and were planning to use him in a ritual to wake up Ymir, the frost giant, right here on Earth. Meanwhile, Mastermind, still in statue form at the mansion, somehow managed to expand his consciousness. He got a brief chance to mess with his powers from afar and decided to get back at the X-Men. While Xavier was out, Mastermind tricked the team into heading to Monster Isle on a fake mission. When Xavier got back and saw his team was MIA, he put his detective hat on and tracked them down. He quickly figured out Mastermind's illusion and beat him in a mental fight. After that, Xavier moved Mastermind's statue self to a more secure spot where he couldn't cause any more trouble. Omega level. Back in the classroom, Xavier kept pushing the X-Men to test their limits. He was especially impressed with Marvel Girl and Iceman, and called them Omega level because of their off-the-charts potential. Xavier's radar picked up on a young mutant named Sonny Barredo, whose powers had unfortunately wiped out his family. But before Xavier could bring him into the school, Sonny vanished. The X-Men got another invite to a big event, the wedding of Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Girl. Just like at the engagement party, they had to act like strangers. Dr. Doom, the big bad guy of Latveria and a longtime enemy of the Fantastic Four, sent a whole squad of supervillains to crash the party. Xavier was on mental overdrive, guiding his students as they squared off against Mole Man and his Moloids, Batroc the Leaper, the Executioner, and even a monster named Grogoom. In the end, Mr. Fantastic came up with a time displacement device the Watcher had given him, and poof, the villains were gone, and the wedding went on like nothing happened. Anti-mutant campaigns on the rise. Anti-mutant sentiments were through the roof, thanks mostly to Bolivar Trask stirring up fear. To counter that, Charles set up a TV debate with Trask, but Trask showed off his Sentinel robots. However, the Sentinels decided humans needed ruling, not saving, and arrested Trask. Xavier called in the X-Men, but they couldn't stop the Sentinels from taking Trask. They tangled with the robots and were randomly shut down. Before they could figure it out, Xavier led them to the Sentinel HQ, which was loaded with heavy-duty weapons. The first fight at the Sentinels' base was rough. Beast and Iceman got caught. While the team regrouped, Xavier did some psychic snooping and found out the Sentinels' boss, Master Mold, was picking Beast's brain about the X-Men. Xavier blocked the info leak, but Master Mold sensed him and booted him out. With his team still inside, Xavier needed to know why that Sentinel back at the debate tanked. He hitched a mental ride back to the city and found out a giant crystal at the Crystal Products building was messing with the Sentinel's signals. He arranged to get the crystal to Sentinel HQ. Meanwhile, Trask, realizing he messed up, took one for the team and destroyed Master Mold, but it was a rough escape for the X-Men, especially Iceman, who was in bad shape. Xavier kept a low profile at the hospital to keep the X-Men's identities under wraps. When they heard Warren's folks were dropping by the school, they rushed back, but everyone except Iceman got kidnapped by Magneto. Fresh from his stranger vacation, he sent Xavier and the team sky high in a balloon and grabbed Warren's parents. Xavier used his mind powers to coach Iceman into stopping Magneto's plan to use Warren's folks to make mutant slaves. He also helped the X-Men safely land and tipped off the Stranger about Magneto's escape. Sure enough, when the X-Men regrouped, the Stranger showed up, sending Magneto again. Fellow mutants weren't the only enemy. The X-Men got hit with some non-mutant drama when Angel's Aunt Mimi went MIA in Brazil. Angel found her in a hidden spot called the Land of Mists and decided to stick around, feeling accepted there. The team was bummed about losing a member, but Charles did his best to lift their spirits. Around this time, Charles started working with FBI agent Baker, who was kind of taking over Fred Duncan's role. He also linked up with his buddy Abel Stack and arranged for Stack's robot, X-50, to hang with the X-Men. They all headed to Mount St. Helens to check out some lava men sightings. Charles gave the heads up that the X-series robots might be a bit iffy. Sure enough, X-50 didn't make it through the fight with the lava men. Then Medusa from the Frightful Four popped up. Charles tried to help her get her memories back and even thought she might be a mutant. But when her old boss, the Wizard, tried to pull her back in with his mind-controlling helmet, Cyclops smashed it and freed Medusa. She decided to go solo, and surprise, Angel came back to the team. Jean was feeling a bit overshadowed in the dude-heavy X-Men and got a chance to shadow the Invisible Girl of the Fantastic Four. They teamed up to take down the Mad Thinker and his awesome android. Xavier's life with the X-Men was always more than just mutant affairs. It was a mix of helping lost superheroes, robot rumbles, and even a bit of love triangle drama. The X-Men's next brush with trouble was Calvin Rankin, aka Mimic, who gained the power to copy anyone's abilities just by being near them. After figuring out who the X-Men were, Mimic snatched Jean and bolted to his secret lab. He thought he could use a device his dad made to lock in his power-stealing ability for good. Turns out it did the opposite, and left him bereft of his powers. Xavier got taken hostage, but then wiped Mimic's memory of the whole ordeal and let him walk. Lucifer, always up to no good, popped up again. He got the Blob and Unas to dress up like X-Men and cause chaos. When Xavier tried to snoop into who was pulling the strings, he got attacked by a mental defense weapon. Beast invented a gadget to block the weapon's effects, and Xavier led the team after Lucifer. At Lucifer's fortress, while trying to stop his Dominus computer from enslaving Earth, Xavier got kidnapped by robots. He figured that only the robots could work the computer, so he told the X-Men to smash them, which left Lucifer's grand plan in the dust. His bosses weren't thrilled and banished him to another dimension. Then there was this mission to catch the Hulk in the Pacific Northwest, but after learning from the Hulk's buddy Rick Jones that the military wanted to weaponize him, Xavier and the X-Men felt for Bruce Banner, Hulk's other half, and let him slip away after pretending their search was a bust. Xavier teamed up with Marvel Girl and the Scarlet Witch to check out some weird thefts at a local museum. They cracked the case to reveal the Mole Man is the mastermind. Nefaria and El Tigre. Later, Xavier introduced a robot named Colosso for training. After a solid session, he let the team take a breather. Alone, Charles had a moment, feeling the weight of his disability. While the X-Men were out, they ran into trouble with Magia boss, Count Nefaria, and his villain squad, Planet Man, the Eel, Scarecrow, the Porcupine, and the Unicorn. Nefaria tried to get the X-Men on his side, but they weren't buying it and ended up as his prisoners. Nefaria then trapped Washington, D.C. under a dome and tried to pin it on the X-Men, demanding a hefty ransom to lift it. Back at base, Xavier offered to help the military with his expertise, a cover to get his astral form close to DC. He guided his team to play along with Nefaria's plan. Using special leg braces for some mobility, Charles snuck into the dome when Nefaria lowered it for the X-Men to collect the ransom. While the baddies squabbled over the cash, Xavier snuck into Nefaria's HQ and shut down his dome device. He even tricked Nefaria and Unicorn into thinking that they got away with the loot, then tipped off the Coast Guard. Once things calmed down a bit, Jean got a letter from her folks enrolling her at Metro College. She left Xavier's school but stayed connected with the team. Then, when the X-Men faced the Locust, a bug-crazy villain, Xavier put on his leg braces again and tried a wise old man act to reason with him. That flopped, but the X-Men stopped his giant insect plan. Back home, Charles dived into upgrading Cerebro and got trapped in a mental loop with the machine. He pulled the sleeping X-Men into his mind, where they teamed up to break him free. After the X-Men and Xavier helped save some kids from a burning orphanage, they headed back to base. Turns out, a mutant alert in New York was a false alarm. Still, the X-Men bumped into El Tigre, an adventurer on the hunt for the other half of this ancient amulet of Kukulkan. Xavier tried to join the fray with his leg braces, but tech issues had him benched, and the team had to go on without him. The X-Men tracked El Tigre and his crew to the American Museum of Anthropology, but they couldn't stop him from stealing the amulet's other half and getting all powered up like Kukulkan. El Tigre managed to block Xavier's mental scans, but Xavier still pinpointed the lost city El Tigre zipped off to. The team got there and managed to take down El Tigre, thereby taking away his newfound powers. But things got a bit messy. Cyclops accidentally struck Angel with his optic blast during the fight. The rise and fall of Factor 3. After the X-Men wrapped up their mission, Xavier got wind of a new threat and started looking for extra muscle for the team. He contacted Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, but they were the Avengers and passed on the offer. Beast and Iceman even tried to recruit Spider-Man, but he wasn't feeling it either. Meanwhile, the Puppet Master tried to mess with Xavier's mind again, but Charles was ready this time with mental defenses. The X-Men's new recruit turned out to be Mimic, who was back in action, but everyone was thrown for a loop when Xavier made him deputy leader out of the blue. Then, the Puppet Master controlled Mimic instead. Xavier sent the team to sort out the Puppet Master and break his hold over Kelvin. Xavier got the X-Men and Mimic prepped for a showdown with a shady group called Factor 3. They sent Banshee and the Ogre to attack the school, but Banshee, who was being blackmailed with an explosive headdress, subtly sabotaged Ogre's plan. The X-Men took down Ogre and freed Banshee. Just when they were digging into Factor 3, the Super Aptoid, hiding out on Xavier's property, woke up. It wanted to turn everyone into androids, starting with the X-Men. Mimic played the hero, tricking the Adaptoid into trying to copy his powers, which knocked both of them out of commission. Mimic lost his powers and left the team. Later, Jean, Charles, and Angel got nabbed by the Warlock, who had some wild plans to rule the world with Jean as his queen. Xavier used his mental might to summon the X-Men. They overpowered Warlock's goons, and while Warlock was distracted, Xavier left him in suspended animation. With Factor 3 still on their radar, Xavier kept the X-Men's training sharp. He was also playing a bit of a matchmaker, nudging Scott and Jean a little closer. While the team was duking it out with the Cobalt Man, Xavier was busy trying to figure out how to rid his stepbrother, aka Juggernaut, of his curse. He'd been holding on to Juggernaut since the X-Men last took him down. Charles hooked himself and Kane up to this Energo Transformer machine, aiming to dive into Kane's mind for a cure. But things went sideways when the Outcast showed up, causing the machine to blow up. Xavier landed in a coma, and Kane got a mental power boost, making him tough enough for the X-Men to handle. He took off after Factor 3 hit him up. With Xavier out cold, the X-Men tapped into his mind to figure out the whole Crimson Gem of Cyttorak story. They even got Doctor Strange to help send Juggernaut to the Crimson Cosmos. But while they were busy, Factor 3 snatched Xavier. Xavier found himself captive in Europe with Banshee. The X-Men tracked down Factor 3's hideout and discovered it was packed with familiar foes like Blob, Unus, Vanisher, and Mastermind, plus Changeling and the so-called Mutant Master. Their grand plan was to trigger a nuclear apocalypse to wipe out humans and let mutants rule. Xavier started working on Changeling, planting doubts about Mutant Master's real intentions. The X-Men managed to stop Factor 3's doomsday plot, and Banshee, Xavier, and Changeling exposed Mutant Master as an alien from the Cyrus race, looking to clear Earth for colonization. Faced with failure, Mutant Master chose suicide over capture, and Factor 3 fell apart, giving someone else all his powers. Back home, the X-Men and Xavier tackled a mind control scientist who had rebuilt a Sentinel. They never quite figured out who was pulling the strings behind that one. Next up, Cyclops started having these freaky visions of a demon. A quick team-up with Doctor Strange sorted it out, revealing the demon hitched a ride with Scott from the Crimson Cosmos. They sent it back to where it came from. Xavier then helped Bernard the Poet, a regular at the X-Men's favorite hangout, Coffee A Go-Go, get a handle on his sudden mutant powers. After that, a weird Cerebro reading led them to drag Dragon Man, an android. Jean took a liking to it, and Dragon Man hung out with the X-Men on a few gigs until Xavier convinced Jean to let it find a new pad on Monster Isle. Feeling the team was ready for an upgrade, Xavier gave some new costumes for the X-Men, but then he caught wind of the Xenox, an alien crew planning to invade Earth. In the midst of prepping a defense, Changeling dropped by, breaking the news that he was on his way out with cancer. Wanting to make amends for his past, he fit right into Xavier's plan. Xavier told Jean about it, transferred his mental powers to Changeling, and secretly boosted Jean's telepathy. Then he tucked himself away in a psi-shielded room in the mansion to work on stopping the Xenox. Changeling, now with Xavier's mental powers, played the part of Xavier so well that even the X-Men were none the wiser. His cover was so good that when he bit the dust battling Grotesque, a subterranean mutant, it only made the ruse more convincing. Tryst with Shi'ar Princess Lilandra Neramani. For a while, the X-Men were on their own, picking up Cyclops' bro Havoc and the magnetically powered Lorna Dane along the way. When the main squad was out, Xavier, who'd been cooking up a plan to stop the Xenox invasion, came out of hiding. He looped in Havoc and Lorna, and later the rest of the team. Filling them in on his undercover stint and the alien threat, Xavier jumped back into the leader's seat and got everyone prepped for the big scuffle. As the X-Men fought with the Xenox, Xavier helped them in his own style. He connected his mind with every good-hearted person on Earth and blasted the Xenox with a wave of positive vibes, courtesy of humanity. This emotional overload sent the aliens, but the effort knocked Xavier out cold. Little did he know, this also linked him psychically with Shi'ar Princess Lilandra Neramini, which would shake things up later. Xavier ended up in a coma and in pretty bad shape. In his mind, he pointed the X-Men toward Bruce Banner, who had a gamma-powered gadget that could fix him up. After a run-in with the Hulk and some military drama, the X-Men got their hands on the device and got Xavier back on his feet. Around the same time, Kraven the Hunter mistakenly outed Spider-Man as a mutant. Still recovering, Xavier helped the X-Men find Spidey, and they teamed up to take down Kraven and the Blob. Then, when the Fantastic Four faced a mystery threat, Mr. Fantastic contacted Xavier for help. Xavier offered up a couple of decommissioned Sentinels to guard the FF's HQ, but their old nemesis Dr. Doom hijacked the Sentinels and sent them on a city-wide rampage. It took the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, X-Men, Daredevil, and Doctor Strange to shut it down, while Xavier and Marvel Girl stopped a Doom-controlled Colosso from stealing Cerebro. Later, when Doom stole the power of Galactus, the X-Men were among the heroes defending Earth. They, including Xavier, seemed to die in the chaos, but Mr. Fantastic, with the Cosmic Cube, turned back time and undid Doom's havoc, bringing everyone back. Stopping Mysterio. Back in tip-top shape, Xavier caught up on what the X-Men were up to while he was out of action, but the treatment he got seemed to mess with his head a bit, as he started treating his seasoned X-Men like they were back in school. He even put them through a mental simulation, pitting them against their toughest enemies. When Xavier found out the team hadn't confirmed Magneto's fate after their last clash, he sent them to the Savage Land for a recon mission, all but Iceman, who had quit. With the team MIA, Xavier called for backup from Lorna and Havoc, accidentally pulling in Iceman too. This led to a spat between Iceman and Havoc over Lorna, which Xavier had to break up. Iceman wasn't keen on following orders anymore and took off. Despite his frustration, Iceman couldn't shake off his concern for his pals and decided to check on them. Meanwhile, Xavier kept guiding Havoc and Lorna, now called the Magnetrix, into the Savage Land, where they joined forces with Kazar to find the missing X-Men. While all this was going down, Warren's girlfriend, Candy Southern, dropped by the mansion with news from home. Xavier was taken aback to find out Warren had told her about the X-Men. He wrestled with the idea of wiping her memory, but ultimately let her keep her knowledge. Soon, the Fantastic Four swung by, curious about why Xavier had probed their minds. This visit coincided with Marvel Girl, Cyclops, and Beast's return to the mansion. Xavier, still reeling from the side effects of his treatment, momentarily thought Jean was back on her first day. He snapped back to reality, filled in both the Fantastic Four and the X-Men about the Xenox invasion, and they all set off to stop the aliens from causing more trouble. While the X-Men were off in space, Xavier had another visit from Candy, still trying to track down Warren. After the team got back, Jean told Xavier about a weird mental blip she had in space. Xavier took her to Maura McTaggart's Mutant Research Center in Scotland for a checkup. They didn't find anything, but this would ripple into something bigger for the X-Men later. Jean was sworn to secrecy about the facility. Back at the mansion, Cerebro flagged a new mutant in Illinois. Xavier and Beast found Ashley Martin, a kid who could control objects, including a Sentinel. Things got tense when the Sentinel went rogue, but Ashley had it destroy itself. Seeing the danger, Xavier put mental blocks on Ashley to stop her from using her powers and wiped her memory of the incident. He stayed back to help her mom, Terry, clean up and deal with the cops. Xavier stuck around to help Ashley and Terry, and he and Terry started getting close. But when Fred Duncan popped by, surprised to find Xavier alive, Charles reassured him everything was under control. The romance with Terry didn't last long though, as her worries about Ashley's mutant future drove them apart. Xavier then got cut off from his mental link with the X-Men and found out Magneto was teaming up with the Submariner for an invasion. He sent his astral form to try and talk Magneto down, but ended up guiding Angel to free Havoc and Lorna from some group called the Promise. With his students scattered, Xavier helped Mr. Fantastic build a weapon to take down Magneto using his powers against him. After helping Havoc escape an anti-mutant mob in New York and assisting the X-Men with the Promise situation, Xavier returned to his body and ended things with Terry. A week later, he and the X-Men threw a birthday bash for Beast's 20th. After all the drama, the X-Men decided to take a well-earned break. Xavier noticed Bobby and Hank were planning to chill at the mansion, so he nudged them to hit the road for a bit of adventure. Meanwhile, NASA roped in Xavier to do a psychic deep dive on a comet, but things got weird when a chunk of alien stuff broke off and landed near the mansion. When the X-Men got back, this alien goop took away their powers just as a bunch of Sentinels decided to crash their party. Powerless, but not helpless, the X-Men tapped into their combat training to fend off the robots and protect Xavier. The Sentinels left when they realized the X-Men were temporarily non-mutant, but then they targeted Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch instead. The X-Men, whose powers were not only coming back but also getting a boost, jumped in to help. Xavier, feeling his own powers ramping up, found the alien junk. Worried about the power surge getting out of hand, he had the team launch it into space, which set everyone back to their normal levels. But that wasn't the end of it. The alien matter messed with the nexus of all realities in a Florida swamp, causing time and space to go haywire. Xavier sent the X-Men to check it out, and they got sucked into different future realities. Xavier used the Man-Thing, guardian of the nexus, as a psychic relay to pull his team back and seal the rift. Next up, they arrived in New York, called in by the Continuities who sensed a reality disturbance. Turned out, Spider-Man's nemesis Mysterio was using swamp water from the Nexus to mess with reality. Xavier and the X-Men managed to put a stop to Mysterio's shenanigans. Trying to stop the Hulk. Xavier teamed up with Reed Richards and Tony Stark to cook up a plan to control the Hulk. They lured the big guy to Boulder Dam and zapped him with a massive electric shock. But Hulk pulled a Houdini and disappeared into the Microverse, courtesy of Cyclops. Around the same time, Moira McTaggart was busy scouting new mutants for her research center on Muir Island. She found Petra, a geomorph, Sway with her time powers, Darwin, the evolution guy, and Kid Vulcan, who could absorb and control energy. Xavier was particularly interested in Vulcan because of his lost memories and energy powers. He introduced Vulcan to the X-Men, noting his knack for handling Cyclops' powers. Xavier was thinking Vulcan could be X-Men material. He also tried to bring Emma Frost, now a stripper at the Hellfire Club, into the fold. But when their recruitment mission went south, thanks to a brawl with a bouncer and Vulcan jumping in, Xavier wiped everyone's memories of the encounter and called it quits on that plan. Then came the formation of the Illuminati. After a Skrull invasion flop during the Kree-Skrull War, Iron Man gathered Xavier, Mr. Fantastic, Doctor Strange, Black Bolt, Namor and Black Panther. Except for Black Panther, they all agreed to create this secret group to handle global threats. The Illuminati then jetted off to the Skrull throne world to warn them off Earth, but Emperor Doric VII wasn't having it and captured them for experiments. They got a rough treatment but managed to escape back to Earth, leaving behind a mess that would come back to haunt them later. Back on Earth, Xavier had Beast and the X-Men investigate some alien sightings for the mysterious Agent Baker, who soon cut ties with being the FBI liaison for the team. Another super team-up. The drama between Iceman, Lorna, and Havoc reached a boiling point, leading to Lorna and Havoc dipping out. But it turned out they were actually taken away by the Secret Empire, a group with big world domination plans that would seriously mess with Xavier and the X-Men. While Xavier was off at Muir Island, the X-Men at home faced a bunch of trouble, like rogue Danger Room robots and some creepy phantoms that looked like Juggernaut and Magneto. When Xavier got back, he found the place a wreck. He rallied the team and dropped that he wanted to take the school global, focusing on helping new mutants. They soon figured out the phantom attacks were all coming from Jean's mind. Xavier and the crew did a deep dive into her psyche and helped her sort out her fears. After that, the X-Men officially graduated from his classes. Beast, now done with school, got a gig at the Brand Corporation. The team said their goodbyes, not knowing Hank would accidentally turn himself into a more beast-like version of himself, a secret he kept from everyone, including Xavier. Then there was this mess with Spider-Man being blamed for kidnapping Xavier's old pal, Hans Jorgensen. Xavier sent the X-Men to find Spidey, and they figured out he was innocent. It was actually Morbius, the living vampire behind the kidnapping. Xavier and Jorgensen came up with a cure for Spidey using Morbius's blood, and Xavier kept Morbius at the mansion for a bit. Angel was worried about Beast, but Xavier stayed out of it. Angel found Beast and his new look, reporting back to the team. Soon after, Beast got caught by the Secret Empire. Unas, too, Magneto came back, took out the X-Men, and even got his hands on some Avengers. Meanwhile, Angel was snatched by the Secret Empire during the chaos. The Avengers, Black Widow, and Daredevil teamed up with the remaining X-Men to rescue the captives, but they were still trying to figure out what happened to Angel. Xavier teamed up with Agent Duncan to brief Shanna, the She-Devil, on mutants Mandrill and Necra. With mutants disappearing left and right, Xavier had Iceman, Cyclops, and Marvel Girl check on allies and enemies. Iceman went MIA soon after. Then Mobius busted out of the mansion, and Cyclops and Xavier couldn't stop him. Xavier, Cyclops, and Marvel Girl got proactive in their hunt for missing allies. Their search led them southwest, where they stumbled upon Juggernaut duking it out with the Hulk. They managed to take down Juggernaut and let Hulk bounce before getting back on track. In Nashville, they ran into Banshee mid-brawl with Captain America and Falcon. Banshee freaked out and split when he thought Xavier and the Cap were after him. Xavier soon figured out Cap and Falcon were also on the Secret Empire's trail, so they teamed up. Things got dicey when Nick Fury and some S.H.I.E.L.D. agents jumped them. Xavier played it cool, using his powers to stay off the radar and keep his X-Men ties hush-hush, and they skedaddled. Piecing together clues, Xavier zeroed in on the Beast's girlfriend, Linda Donaldson, who was in the area and linked to the Secret Empire. Cap, Cyclops, and Falcon pulled a heist act, nabbing an electro-gyro from Brand Corps and getting invited to the Secret Empire's lair. Xavier and the remaining X-Men tailed them, but the plan hit a roadblock when the Secret Empire saw through the ruse and tried to snatch Cap and Falcon. Xavier and his crew jumped in for the save. They found not only their captured teammates, but also Blob, Unus, Mastermind, and Mesmero, all being used as batteries for some weapon. Just when it looked grim with an atomic annihilator weapon pointed at them, S.H.I.E.L.D. agents Gabe Jones and Peggy Carter, who'd infiltrated the Empire, fired a harmless blast instead. With everyone safe, they took on the Secret Empire's attempt to storm the White House. The X-Men freed their pals, busted the Empire. Cap revealed their leader was a high-ranking government official who offed himself rather than get caught. Later, Xavier got a telepathic call from Russian operative Alexei Vazhin, looking for help protecting a mutant named Pyotr Rasputin from his own government. Xavier promised to stay in touch and keep Rasputin safe. Second Genesis. Later, Xavier caught wind of a mutant signal on Krakoa Island and rallied his X-Men for a recon mission. Meanwhile, Magneto was stirring the pot again. He rebooted his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Xavier asked Doctor Strange's crew, the Defenders, for backup. They tracked down Magneto, who introduced his new creation, Alpha, the Ultimate Mutant. The fight shifted to the United Nations, where Alpha, after gaining peak evolution, decided to play judge. He ended up siding with the good guys and turned Magneto and his crew into kids before zooming off to explore the cosmos. Xavier handed the kiddified Brotherhood to Moira McTaggart, hoping they'd grow up nice this time. But back at Krakoa, things went south. The X-Men got tangled up with some weird creatures, and Xavier lost contact with them. In a panic, he asked Moira if her students could help. Moira agreed, and Xavier fast-tracked their training with his mental powers. He also dropped a bombshell on Kid Vulcan. Cyclops was his brother, but the mission was a disaster. Only Cyclops made it back. Realizing his mistake, Xavier wiped Cyclops and Moira's memories of the failed rescue and prepped for another go. Xavier then put together a global mutant dream team, including old allies Banshee and Sunfire, and new faces like Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, Nightcrawler, and Thunderbird. This squad managed to save the original X-Men and booted Krakoa into space. Xavier kept the failed mission and the loss of Vulcan's team under wraps, a secret he'd carry for years. After the Krakoa ordeal, most of the OG X-Men split to do their own thing, except Cyclops. Xavier and Cyclops got to work training this new batch of X-Men who were set to become legends in their own right. So, that was all about Professor X in the comics, but of course, how could we possibly leave his movies behind?
I'm Charles Xavier. Would you like some breakfast?
Where am I?
Cinematic Mastery, exploring Charles Xavier's portrayal. In the X-Men movies, Professor X, played by Patrick Stewart, sends some of his crew to save Wolverine and Rogue from Sabretooth, one of Magneto's cronies. He promises to help Wolverine with his memory issues, but then Mystique sneaks into the mansion, messes with Cerebro, and Xavier gets poisoned. He bounces back though, and points Wolverine towards some clues at Alkali Lake. In X2, X-Men United, Xavier is busy tracking down Nightcrawler, while Magneto, under someone's control, captures him. William Stryker's plan was to use Xavier and a makeshift Cerebro to fry every mutant's brain. Xavier gets rescued just in time by Storm and Nightcrawler and ends up having a heart-to-heart with the President about mutant-human relations. X-Men The Last Stand doesn't have much of Xavier. He's in a flashback, trying to get Jean Grey to join his school, and later, he admits he put mental blocks on Jean to control her powers. When Jean, now Phoenix, returns, Xavier tries to calm her down, but she disintegrates him. There's a hint at the end that his mind might have survived in another body. In X-Men Origins Wolverine, Xavier again played by Stewart, makes a cameo where he rescues some Weapon X escapees. X-Men First Class takes us back to Xavier's early days, with James McAvoy playing a young Charles. We see his friendship with Magneto in the start of the X-Men. We also learn he and Mystique were like siblings once. In The Wolverine, Stewart's Xavier appears in a post-credit scene with Magneto. X-Men Days of Future Past has both McAvoy and Stewart as young and older Xavier, respectively. Future Xavier is fighting for mutant survival against Sentinels and sends Wolverine back in time to get young Xavier on board to stop Mystique from killing Bolivar Trask. Young Xavier's in a rough spot, having disbanded the X-Men and lost his powers, but he comes around to help Wolverine. X-Men Apocalypse has McAvoy's Xavier facing off against Apocalypse, who wants his body and powers. Xavier fights him mentally, and with Jean Grey's help, they defeat Apocalypse. In Logan, Stewart's final appearance as Xavier shows him as an aging, ailing man cared for by Logan. Suffering from Alzheimer's, he's haunted by a past tragedy where he hurt people with his powers. He bonds with Laura, a young Wolverine clone, and is killed by X-24, a perfect Wolverine clone.
Seal your fate.
Small screen brilliance, Charles Xavier's impactful presence and evolution in television. Professor X has been all over the animation scene and first appeared in 1966's Marvel Superheroes, where he was with the Allies of Peace, basically the OG X-Men. In 1981, he was in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, where he tackled Cyberiad. Stan Jones gave him his voice. In 1989, Pride of the X-Men saw Xavier guiding Kitty Pryde around the Institute and introduced her to the X-Men squad. When Magneto and his crew made a move, Xavier sent his team to space for a fight. John Stevenson voiced him here. X-Men the Animated Series in '92 features Xavier as the founder of the X-Men battling his old pal Magneto. Cedric Smith lends his voice. Xavier also appears in Spider-Man the Animated Series, helping Spidey with his mutation woes. X-Men Evolution in 2000 shows a younger Xavier, running the Institute and dealing with all sorts of mutant drama, including his son David Huller's multiple personalities. In Superhero Squad Show from 2009, he appears in the Mysterious Mayhem at the Mysterious Mutant Academy episode, voiced by Jim Ward. Wolverine and the X-Men in 2009 starts with Xavier and Jean Grey MIA post-explosion. He's in a coma in Genosha, and when found, he shows the X-Men a grim future, urging them to reunite. Iron Man Armored Adventures has a cameo of Xavier in the X-Factor episode, where he approaches Jean Grey. In the 2011 X-Men anime, Xavier reunites the team to save Armor from the U-Men. The show Legion heavily hints at Xavier, but shows him in person only in the third season, with Harry Lloyd playing the role. Here, he battles the psychic mutant Amal Farouk, the Shadow King, and has a complicated history with his son, David Haller. So that was all in this video. If you've reached this point, I suggest you check out our video on Magneto's life story.
And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.